Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Professor Subhash Kak, Padma Shri awardee, professor of computer science. He lives in the United States. And we join him to talk a little bit about Panini, who essentially formalized Sanskrit and gave it the power that we see in it now. To know more about this, let's join Professor Subhash Kak. Subhash ji, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you, Sri Iyer ji. Delighted to be on the channel.
So, Subhash ji, Panini was, I think, 600 BCE. I could be off a little bit about thereabouts, right? So maybe you can describe what this state was, where he was from, and how he came about doing all this research in Sanskrit. And essentially, you have the floor, sir.
Well, of course, there are many legends about Panini. And we know that he's called Dakshi Putra, that his mother was Dakshi. And he was from northwest India. And the other legends about him are that he was not very smart. Then he goes to the forest and he worships Shiva. And then he comes back and he's a genius. Now, it's not correct, as the general impression goes, that there was no study of Sanskrit prior to Panini. There were many disciplines within the various Vedic shakhas where language was studied. There was also Yaska's Nirukta. So there was all these elements were there. But what he did something so audacious. He was able to describe the entire grammar of Sanskrit language in terms of about 4,000 sutras or 4,000 rules in a manner where he also used a technical language, a kind of a meta language, which had its own rules. And so this was a structure which is a very abstract structure, which is so marvelous in its conception that it's like the scholars who have studied it in the last 100 years, they say it's not only perhaps the most amazing achievement of any human being, but in its very structure, it has the form of a computer program. Because what do you have in a computer program? You have, let's say you're processing a language. You have expressions in that language, but then you also have a technical language, which is your program, right? Which is your programming language, which doesn't have the same structure as your ordinary language. And that's precisely what Panini did. He had both the standard language, which is Sanskrit, in which the various derivations were obtained, but also the technical language associated with this grammar. Now, so incredible achievement. And then, of course, you had Mahabhashya of Patanjali, who it so turns out, according to most scholars, that he was from the region that I'm from, namely Kashmir. Yeah. So that I am sort of pleased. I must smile. And then, of course, there are many other great scholars who were from all over India, including the South. Siddhanta Kamuti, I believe, is also one of them. So there were great stuff that was written, which sort of simplified it for most students. Not everybody could go through the discipline of mastering Panini's grammar. Now, an interesting story is this, that in the 19th century, when Western scholars like Whitney, who wrote a book on Sanskrit grammar, came across, and he was an American scholar, he came across Panini's Ashtadhyaya. He says, well, this is very artificial. What is this? I'm not going to write it this way, because he could not understand the whole conceptual paradigm, because there was no computer science at that time. Later on, people realized that Ashtadhyaya, Panini's grammar, anticipates the Turing machine. It anticipates computer program. So in that sense, it is as if you go back 2000 years and out of nowhere, a person creates a form which is the most marvelous and amazing. Why would a person think of such a structure? Now, a personal story. How I got into my own studies on Indian science and Vedic wisdom and everything else, it's all a huge, amazing package, was that in the 80s when I was doing AI, I sort of remember my father used to tell me when I was young that, look, Panini did this, Panini did that, so I thought I should explore it. And then I was flabbergasted to read in standard textbooks or Indian history books that during the time of Panini, there was no writing in India. You got to use common sense. Why would anybody in a time when there was no writing create such an abstract structure where there are so many intermediate steps? And of course, you have other texts, for example, texts related to Buddha's childhood, which say, well, there were 64 scripts at the time of Buddha's childhood. So sadly, what has happened in India is that people have been forced to accept a specific view that this is how it was, even if it's at variance and conflict with literary evidence. Let me give you another example. Often it is stated in Indian magazines and newspapers, and there was a story in the Hindu newspaper, for example, some time ago, that murtis were used in India only after 6th century CE or AD. Totally false, because Panini's Ashtadhyaya already speaks about murtis. He speaks about Utsav murtis. So if there were Utsav murtis, there were also Pratishthit murtis. And my own researches on Vedic ritual, for example, Agnichayan ritual, shows that when that big Agnichayan Vedi was made, on the top layer, the top prastara, a golden image of Purusha was put in a hollow brick, so that there were murtis being used. And sadly, there's a lot of misconception and lack of knowledge even amongst experts, because mostly it's bookish knowledge. An expert is reading other books by others, and therefore a time has come, I believe, that all of this needs to be rejuvenated, and the correct knowledge, which they can check for themselves. They should not believe me. They should see what people are saying, and then go and check the texts for themselves, texts which have not suffered any single interpolation, which is true of Panini's grammar, not a single interpolation.
So there has been a lot of literature found on palm leaves, isn't it? I mean, that's how they used to write, on a palm leaf, and that used to preserve for a while, isn't it? I mean, just one place to record data.
Well, in the north, it was written on birch bark.
Okay.
Because you don't have palm leaves in the north, and in the south on palm leaves. Now, according to scholars who do epigraphic work, there are more texts in India which have not been examined, several million, because books were being written or texts were being written. And of course, some of that is astrological or maybe horoscopes and so on, but there are many, many other texts which have not yet been examined. So we don't know at this point as to what other gems lie to be examined.
Now, if you could think of a place where these could be, where would that be?
Oh, they are in families, in villages. You could have somebody or the other, who would traditionally do this kind of work or do texts or was into traditional learning. So these could be with in people's homes, and some of these texts are then being damaged with time. And then there are also texts in various libraries and museums, and not all of which have yet been studied systematically.
This reminds me, there's this antique show that is very popular in some TV channels in the United States. Perhaps one TV channel in India should take up this, because this is one way to go and rediscover our history that's buried in somebody's vault, somebody's, closet space or something like that. And who knows what kind of riches it's going to unearth. Subhashji, I've heard of one story, and I'm not sure if this is right or wrong, but there is one story of Nataraja doing cosmic dance in Chidambaram. You know that famous pose of Nataraja, that's a dance of king of dance, right? Nataraja is king of dance. And it is believed that when he was dancing, sounds were coming from the damaru that he had in his hand. On the left side of the damaru, whatever sound that came, that was noted down by Panini, and that became Sanskrit. And whatever was coming from the right side of the damaru was Tamil, and that was noted down by Agastya. I don't know if you've heard this story or not, but this is one of the stories that I have been told a few years back about how Sanskrit and Tamil were more or less, came out at the same time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. I've heard of it. And certainly the basis of Panini's grammar are these sutras, which are called Maheshwar Sutras. And so it does tie up, because that's the name he gave to these sutras, which helps him classify different sounds of Sanskrit. So there is a certain element which certainly ties up. One doesn't have to look at these stories literally, but indeed, if Shiva's space and time is beyond our space and time, then one can understand how they can span different historical times and still be considered to be at the same time.
That's wonderful. Now, after Panini, how was the sutras? How were the sutras handed down? Because they are still available today. I think Professor Bhandarkar was probably one of those who kind of did a rejuvenation, and there are many scholars in the South. I'm forgetting the names. So maybe you can give us a journey of what you think happened after Panini, how these sutras were saved.
Well, no, I think they were widely known. If you wanted to study Sanskrit, you studied Panini, and then you studied Mahabhashya, then you studied other tikas that were written. And so they were never lost. Now, what happened in the 19th century was Dayanand Saraswati's attempt to go back to the Vedas. So the Arya Samaj had a deliberate policy of studying Paniniya sutras. And so they did a lot of scholarship in creating pathshalas where the new generations would do it. So they were never lost. Panini has been a part of our cultural life as long as, for the past 2,500 years.
So you think that it might have been offered as part of the curriculum in the Gurukulas that used to exist before Lord Macaulay came and dismantled the whole lot and so on?
I agree. And in fact, as you know, Dr. Nagaswamy of Tamil Nadu, he's done some wonderful work on the epigraphics related to certain temples, and he shows how these temples had pathshalas and what the wonderful stuff that Dr. Nagaswamy has done. And I had the good fortune of meeting him, being on the same panel at the big conference in Chicago.
World Hindu Congress in September last year.
World Hindu Congress, where I also met you. I had the good fortune of meeting you. And Dr. Nagaswamy shows how in these pathshalas, what the salary was, what the curriculum was. It was fantastic. So there was a whole system of schooling which was open to every community. I hate the word caste because the word caste has no equivalent in any Indian language.
Yes.
We have the word jati. Jati means your family, community background. So people from all communities or kids from all communities studied at these pathshalas. And the other person who has done great work on that is Mr. Dharampal, who wrote this famous book called The Beautiful Tree. And this book is freely available on the internet, where what he did was to use not hearsay, but they published accounts of British educators who came to India to talk about how the Indian education system worked in the early decades of the 19th century. And there you realize that Indian literacy at that time, you can estimate, was probably 50-60%, was much higher than Europe's. And there is a breakdown of students from all jatis, and you find that this misconception that education was only limited to Brahmins, etc., is so totally ridiculous. In fact, I think what we have done in the last 20-30 years by people who are so horribly misinformed is to demonize our own culture, to deny ourselves some of the most amazing insights that humanity has created, and then say, hey, what's wrong with us? Why can't we do this or that? If we only partook of all the power that we have, then we'll know that it's different. Now, we see in amongst people who don't deny, there's more of such denial going on in India than in the US. For the last 10-15 years, if you look at the spelling bee, and some people, of course, laugh at the spelling bee, almost all the winners have been Indian. It's open to everybody. And this year, 7 of the 8 joint winners were Indian. Some people say, well, memorizing words is easy, but so is walking and running. But we still praise runners who run faster than everybody else. And this year, in the most exclusive and competitive science talent competition of the US, where everybody wants to do as well, every community, every region, 17 of the 40 finalists are Indian. And last year, 16 of the 40 finalists were Indian. Because these are Indian kids, mostly, who celebrate our past. And most of them also celebrate Sanskrit, as they should, because Sanskrit is something beautiful. In fact, my own children, when they were in high school, they also did courses on Latin. We love everything which is positive. And we realized that tens of thousands of students or hundreds of thousands of students in American schools do Latin. And one reason why they do it is because they say, well, the terminology is helpful if you're doing medicine or law. But the terminology of Sanskrit is even more helpful, not in just medicine and law and spirituality and in psychology and every other subject. Why are we turning our backs to it is an amazing thing that I can't understand.
I think things are changing, and I think in this new regime, maybe Prime Minister Modi will pay more attention to what needs to be taught at the schools. And I think one of the things that you're alluding to through Professor Dr. Nagaswami's work is the fact that the temple was not a place where one went to pray. The temple was where everybody lived their lives. I mean, from the morning till evening, there was something to do at the temple. You had classes, you had pathshalas, you had cultural events, you had debates. Everything revolved around the temple. And I don't know if there is a way we can go back to that, but I can tell you, sir, some of the temples in the United States are beginning to start embracing this idea. I know 3 or 4 large temples in the Bay Area, and also know some temples in the South that are doing this, where you come to the temple almost all day on the weekend, one day of the weekend, because the other day is probably for other things. And they learn Sanskrit, they learn Bharatanatyam, they learn vocal, parents also, are free to do other things. And thereby we are beginning to recreate that ecosystem that used to exist many hundreds of years ago. I only wish that India and the great South temples, the temples in Tamil Nadu and Kerala and Andhra Pradesh, my God, such grandeur. And I hope that, these things start living again. And I really hope and pray that this vision is embraced by the government. Thank you very much, Professor Subhash Kak ji. If you would like to add anything in the end, please feel free to do so.
No, I think what you said is perfect, apt. perhaps just to add to what you said, one thing that they could also do is all the big temples in India and in the US, maybe separately, could create some kind of a virtual university so that people who wanted to do deeper research, and they could form their own board or something so as to certify that there are certain standards. Just as you have UGC, maybe we don't always have to do everything through UGC. Private initiative by the temples could be taken so that they can also offer more advanced certifications and degrees. And there are a lot of not just Indians but Westerners, because this is universal knowledge.
Yes.
This knowledge which is humanity. Yoga, for example, lived Hinduism is yoga. This is universal knowledge. Let's give it to everybody. Let's share it with every human being.
Absolutely, sir. And thank you very much for your time. And we'll be back with more such interesting conversation. Thank you, Professor Kak.